So it's increasingly looking like Russia is going to lose, but it doesn't look like that on the ground. Now, I'm going to lay out my case on why experts think that Russia is going to lose in Ukraine, but you got to stick with me. I'm going to work you through about a dozen different articles, and you'll understand by the time we get to the end. Okay, so if you start here, let's just look at what's going on the ground. Wide-scale Russian attacks target Ukraine's energy grid, leaving millions without electricity. So this is looking very bad for the Ukrainians, right? Russia has launched new wide-scale missile strikes, says Zelensky. Ukrainian authorities say nearly 1.5 million households are without electricity, so this is an intentional campaign to do this. They've downed 18 out of 33 cruise missiles, but that means 15 got through and are doing damage. Now, this is day over day over day since October 10th. It is now the 23rd, and so it's just been an ongoing barrage. The main target is of the terrorists is energy, he said. And then when you get down here, Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal warned if there is no more electricity, no more heating, no more water in Ukraine, this can trigger a new migration tsunami. And so that's what's going on with why the Russians are doing what they're doing. They're trying to make it miserable for the Ukrainians by attacking the civilian infrastructure. Meanwhile, Russia's Shoigu warns the uncontrolled escalation in Ukrainian conflict is a very legitimate possibility, and so he's hinting towards things here with it. So Sergei Shoigu told his French counterpart in a telephone call on Sunday the situation in Ukraine was rapidly deteriorating towards uncontrolled escalation. I won't be able to stop it. Besides, we found out, he says. Shoigu said Moscow had concerns that Ukraine could use a dirty bomb in the conflict. Okay, Ukraine has very little incentive to do this because that would be affecting their population. We're going to infect our own population. Well, he's saying as a false flag operation, that's what the idea would be with a dirty bomb. Now, this terrifies me, and I'll tell you why. Because when the Russians say that Ukraine is doing this, or the Americans are doing that, or the Europeans are doing this, they're usually doing it. I don't know that Russians doing it. They could just be bluffing about this, but that is really nerve-wracking to my mind that he would be pointing, not that he's saying that he's going to use a dirty bomb, but that he's warning that the Ukrainians are likely doing that. We forget as we're looking at these events that there's like still a hot war going on. There's fighting, like Russia says its forces prevented an attempt by Ukraine to break through its line in Kherson, where it anticipates a wider Ukrainian counteroffensive. That's still going on because we're so preoccupied with missiles and other things along those lines. In Kherson, the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Group says that the evacuations enforced disappearance of more Ukrainian hostages. I'm not going to go into this article, but the idea is that these Ukrainians are disappearing. There's really legitimately genocide here. Ukrainians are disappearing. We don't know where they're going. Some want to go to Russia. That's fine. I mean, if you want to go, go. I mean, that's one thing. But some are taking against their will, including children, and that's a very bad thing. Okay. Latvian foreign minister says there's little hope for Ukraine war negotiations until clear defeat of Russia. So this is part of my major point. There has to be a clear defeat. This war, I don't believe, will end in some kind of peace treaty halfway. I think either Ukraine or Russia is going to be defeated and then have to just knuckle under and succumb to whatever terms. That's how it's going to end. And so I think it's going to be Russia, and I'll tell you why in just a little bit. You'll see in these articles why. Okay, Latvian Foreign Minister Egers Renoviks said that he has little hope of a diplomatic solution in the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine, quote, until we see the clear defeat of Russia. I think the Russian tactics have changed from direct military confrontation to a tactic that we know and remember from the times of fascist Germany, the genocide of the Ukrainian people. Weren't we just talking about that? And by the way, I think that also does not facilitate any diplomatic efforts. So it's hard to be diplomatic when your cities are under attack from cruise missile strikes daily for 15 days, 14, well, whatever it was, 14 days in a row. That doesn't exactly win friends and influence people. So that was the point of his message here, and I think he's right, and I think it's going to be the Russians that lose, and I'll explain why in a little bit. In the meantime, there were some political statements that were maybe not the best, like this guy in Germany, Kretschmer said Russian gas should resume after the Ukrainian war. Now, I don't know what his context was. Maybe it was not, it sounds tone deaf, and it could have been a legit thing to say in that context, and they probably will resume. I think that Russian gas and oil energy should be used, should be go to whatever European nations after the war in order to pay for reparations to Ukraine. Like all that revenue should go right into rebuilding Ukraine. So it shouldn't be gone. But he's making the same mistake. So the German leaders that got into this problem by being so dependent, Merkel was talking about this the other day. Like she made a great deal with German oil and gas, but you were dependent on this one source, and now this puts you in a bad way. So you don't want to repeat that same mistake. Even if the money is being used to rebuild Ukraine, you still don't want to put yourself in that kind of bad way. Politico, this was looking at the United States with Liz Cheney. Cheney slams pro-Putin McCarthy. Now, be careful with politicians talking about other politicians, because very often it's hyperbolic. And what I mean by that is they're not always talking in truth, they're talking in ways to win. And so she is kind of a gadfly within the Republican Party. I don't particularly like her. I think she did Trump wrong. And then at the same time, I do like her she's a war hawk, right? She is a Reagan Republican. In one way, I'm like, yes, and another way, no. Okay, Liz Cheney on Sunday branded Kevin McCarthy as the leader of the pro-Putin wing of the GOP. Don't say that. Don't encourage that. But she's trying to make a distinction between her type and the other type. Just don't push him in that direction. Cheney, a staunch foreign policy hawk, added, quote, "It's dangerous. He knows better, but the fact is he's willing to go down the path of suggesting that America will no longer stand for freedom. I think tells you he's willing to sacrifice everything for his own political gain. Just don't do that. This intramural squawk between conservatives is not going to help get where we're trying to go, and that is we want both to win and support Ukraine, and it's just all bad. Okay, next. Okay, Ukraine war, Vladimir Putin would sacrifice 20 million soldiers to win and ensure political survival. Hey, Darren, didn't you just say that the premise of this is that Russia is going to lose? Yes, but understand Putin's mindset first. Vladimir Putin is lucky, not smart. His luck is over, says Boris Bondarev, who quit Russia's permanent mission at the UN over the Ukraine crisis. Okay, so here he's just a couple of quotes. After losing the war, there may be an opposition who will try to depose him, or he will try to purge his subordinates to find some people who could be blamed for all these problems. Well, this latter part is certainly true, that he's already blaming different people, blaming generals for this, or blaming people who are involved in the conscription for the way that mobilization was done, or whatever else. That's certainly going on. You should have no doubt about it. He may sacrifice 10 or 20 million Russians just to win this war, or to slaughter all Ukrainians. It's a matter of political survival to him. Okay, yeah, he does want to do, like, he wants to win at all costs. But so does Zelensky. But Zelensky has home field advantage, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, the real trick with Putin is this. Putin's term, he only has until 2024. He's the president of Russia. They have term limits, 2-year terms, and then he sat out for, here it is. It was Putin for first and second terms, then he sat out for Dmitry Medvedev, and then he's in his third and now fourth term. And he only has until 2024 to make this actually work. And then he's constitutionally ineligible in the Russian system to run for office again. Now, let's switch gears. In Ukraine, trend lines point to escalation, not an endgame. This was a very insightful article. The Ukrainians are determined to take back all of Ukraine. Now, this is the real eye-opener to me, said retired U.S. Army General David Petraeus. Now, when Petraeus speaks, I listen. He's the former head of CIA, formerly in charge of all of what was going on in Afghanistan, wrote the manual on counterinsurgency. Okay? He said the ongoing offensive has Ukrainians thinking that they might be able to drive out Russian troops altogether. Like, that's the Ukrainian mindset. Okay, even if President Volodymyr Zelensky reached some conclusion that maybe we should, to stop the punishment, we should negotiate, I don't think he can do that anymore because of the conviction of the Ukrainian people. So, you have two leaders who are both boxed in. Putin has to win, but so does Zelensky. Like, Putin is not in charge. He can't like just go, well, it was a good try. Let's get his whole career will be ruined if he does that. So there are pro-nationalist forces that are kind of pushing him to win, let alone his own ego or his own resume or whatever. Zelensky's in the same kind of place where he has to win as well, but it's for a different reason. Let's go a little bit further. A top Ukrainian official, Andrei Yermak, said it has been repeated many times, and this is the whole premise of what I'm talking about here. It's been repeated many times that Russia must not win the war. It's time to edit the phrase, Ukraine must win the war. And I think that's the right perspective. I think for many reasons within both Ukraine and geopolitically, Ukraine must win this war. And then finally, David Petraeus thinks the harsh weather favors the Ukrainians on the battlefield. Now, I've talked about this, where the winter, Putin thinks that the winter is going to be his friend. I think it's going to be hard on Ukrainians. They're facing a hard slog, but watch this. Ukrainians can knock on the door and be taken in and get warmed up and get a bowl of soup from their fellow citizens. And of course, they're welcomed as liberators. Not so for the Russians. The Ukrainians are trying to kill them. It's just going to be different for the way it plays out for both sides, and I think that's a fair understanding. Okay, another article. This is from USA Today. I don't usually quote USA Today, but this was actually really, really insightful. Okay, doomed to failure. The Russians failed to heed lessons from history before invading Ukraine. And they go back to a lot of lessons from a number of different countries. 8 years in Vietnam, 9 years in Afghanistan, 20 years in Afghanistan, 8 years in Iraq, 8 months and counting in Ukraine. How long does it take for a great power to develop military amnesia? So he talked first about the Russians. Russia should understand the danger of unpopular foreign intervention. For almost 3 years, from June 1941 to December 1944, Hitler's Nazi army laid waste to large swaths of the Soviet Union during what Russians still called the Great Patriotic War. 872-day siege of Leningrad, remember that? But Russians had the home field advantage. Right? Historians' analysis of why Hitler's Russia invasion failed carry eerie echoes of current experts' analysis of the mistakes of Vladimir Putin has made in invading Ukraine. There was poor strategic planning. Remember that? Remember how they invaded? It was just like, oh, it's just going to fold. Well, it didn't. Okay, the Germans had no long-range plans for the invasion's aftermath. Hitler believed that the Russians would capitulate quickly after the shock. This word here I can't pronounce, but it's translated as motherland. For Russians, they were determined to defend their motherland at all costs. This is where the Ukrainians are right now. They're determined at all costs to defend their own land. Americans, same thing. The British troops fought George Washington's army for nearly a decade before withdrawing in disgrace. Now, Washington wasn't a great general. He ran a track meet for most of this. Like, he was just trying to not get captured through most of it. And every once in a while, like Christmas at Trenton, he would bag an army, or finally at Yorktown, he'd bottle them up against the French fleet and he'd bag the army. But they had home field advantage, and that's what's the important critical thing here. This is why Ukraine's going to win. Okay, 8 months later, this is checking on modern day Ukraine. 8 months later, Ukrainian soldiers are encircling Russian troops as they withdraw from key strategic positions. And the Ukrainians have killed more Russians than the Afghanis have in a decade of war in Afghanistan in 6 months or less. I mean, it's really amazing. Okay, no nation more than Russia should have foreseen this. The Ukrainian invasion started almost 33 days to the day when the last Soviet troops left Afghanistan. And that's, I mean, it's really, wow. Okay, Putin appeared to have gotten away with this in 2014 when he, came in and annexed Crimea and invaded those areas in Donbass. And so after 2014, the Ukrainians started really paying attention. In fact, the world started paying attention at that point. Now Putin faces a united nation headed by a heroic leader in Volodymyr Zelensky, bolstered by billions in aid from the United States and other allies. So it's a very different picture than what it was in 2014. And finally this, there's no chance that Zelensky will accept a negotiated peace that leaves the Kremlin in control of the territories that it has seized. Putin's veiled threat of using tactical nuclear weapons is an empty bluff of a poker player holding a weak hand. And he concludes with this line, Russia's will to conquer is weaker than Ukraine's will to save its homeland. That is what you need to understand. I don't think it's a matter of you need to stop Russia from Winning? No, Ukraine will win. That should be the headline, and that's where we are today. Okay. Thank you for your time. I'm sorry I couldn't cover everything. There were a number of other articles that I wanted to cover, but this is what was the big news today. Thank you. I'll be back tomorrow, and we'll talk some more.